Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Many thanks to our hosts in Italy for facilitating civil society's engagement with the G20 and for including the Center for International Private Enterprise in this year's C20 Summit. My name is Luisa Tomar. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE as we call it, working at the intersection of technology and democracy. Today's theme, human-centered governance for digital transformation, is designed to elicit new ideas around how we govern and regulate technology to ensure it is inclusive, pro-democracy, and pro-humanity. I'm delighted to be joined by such esteemed panelists, Lourdes Montenegro, leading the digital benchmark at the World Benchmarking Alliance, Felipa Amanta, the head of research at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, and Paula Galvez, a strategic advisor on digital regulation to the presidency of the Councils of Ministers in Peru. Before we jump into the conversation with our panelists, I want to take a moment to contextualize what I think of when I hear human-centered governance and why I believe this topic is so timely and important for civil society dialogue and action. This may be an oversimplification, but when it comes to products, including technology tools, platforms, and devices, human-centered design is an approach to product development based on building empathy with people who are end users. The assumption is that by understanding their needs and preferences, a company can build a product, often through iteration and feedback, that their customers will find both useful and easy to use. Now, taking this framework, we approach digital governance through a lens of empathy with people and place their inclusion, security, and rights at the core of digital governance, rather than, say, convenience or government policy objectives. This is important because many end users are often not aware of the harms they may be experiencing online, such as surveillance, targeted advertising, cyber attacks, hacking, misinformation, and the list goes on. Moreover, like with product design, human-centered governance means how we govern, from development to implementation and enforcement, should be iterative, especially as new harms and risks evolve, and participatory of end users of both public policy and technology, whether it be our privacy rights or the software and devices we use. To get there, we the people must be included in the ongoing design of governance frameworks, standards, and regulations for a digital world. Civil society, including entrepreneurs, small business owners, women, girls, marginalized communities, and those from developing economies must have a voice in governing their own interests when it comes to digital transformation. While such an approach sounds daunting, digital technologies are also innovative tools for inclusive, participatory, and iterative democratic processes. I remain hopeful that we can tackle this challenge together. I'll now turn it over to our speakers to get their perspectives on this topic, which I imagine may differ from my own. Let's start with you, Lourdes. Please introduce yourself and your work and tell us what human-centered governance for digital transformation means to you, and how does that differ from what we have today?
Thanks, Luisa. I really love the term human-centered governance. I've actually been working on digital sector topics for quite a while already, working on technology policy, and my work at the World Benchmarking Alliance is really about building a movement for positive change within the digital sector. And we provide tools to help our colleagues in civil society, to help investors invest responsibly. We provide tools such as corporate benchmarking data, and we rank and score the world's largest, most influential technology sector companies on many of the issues that touch on what we might call human-centered governance, actually. But before we get into that and into the details of that, I'm a big sci-fi fan. And as you know, I've been waiting for a new movie release on Frank Herbert's Dune. And it finally came out. But perhaps for those of us who don't know, there's a really good set of two sentences in Doom, which leads us to think about human-centered governance and the crises that the world is in today. So it just struck me when the writer said, once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. So it's really that's the core of the issue for me of human-centered governance and the crises, the technological governance crises that we are facing today. At the World Benchmarking Alliance, we've been working really hard to provide data on what companies are doing in terms of a range of issues. So when we think of human-centered governance, it's really at the heart of it as well is inclusion. So there's already a word called digital inclusion. It's a term that most people use, but it's been limited in its usage to connectivity, to access to technologies. But it's really, if we truly are to have human-centered governance, then we must have digital inclusion broadly conceived. So it's not just about access to technologies universally, especially for vulnerable groups. It's about skills. It's about trustworthiness. Do we trust not the technology, because technology is not something to trust in itself. It is the institutions, the corporations, and the people behind the technology that must prove themselves to be trustworthy. Because technology is dual use. It can be used for the good and it can be used for the bad. So we need to think about whether we have those trustworthy institutions, whether the corporations themselves who are designing this technology are worthy of our trust. Do they respect our privacy? Do they respect the rights of children online? Do they respect our democracies? And finally, I think one forgotten component often is the notion that it's not just about using and participating in the digital economy. That means that we also ultimately have the right to innovate, to participate in the innovation. That's why I really like what you said, Luisa, when you said it's really about people being able to participate in the governance of the digital economy. And that includes participating in the process of innovation itself. And that means that we must look at how diverse, how inclusive our research and development process is. Does it include the voices of women? Does it include the voices of people of color, of disadvantaged communities? Are our corporations trustworthy enough that they consider and look at, for example, the ethical implications of their design and use of artificial intelligence? So these are really very important questions to think about. And our findings from 2020 was really astounding. I mean, personally, I was astounded. To give you an example, we found, for example, that only 16 out of 100 of the world's most influential technology companies have any framework or guidance that they follow on AI ethics. And we don't ask for more. We're just asking, do you have a framework? Do you have a guidance? And even something as simple, as elementary, as having a set of principles to follow when you're designing, thinking machines, essentially, they fall short. They don't even have it. We know the company, the famous company now, I hate to waste my words on that, but it's in the news. Social media company, Facebook, for example, they're one of them who does not have one. So I think it begins, at that very policy level for a company to be sincere and to look at the ethical implications of what they're doing. Actually, most of the platforms don't have these ethical frameworks. Ironically, it's the hardware companies and the telco companies who have them. And they're not necessarily the companies who are at the bleeding edge of the development of algorithms themselves. So So these are very astounding results that, should alarm us and move us to action towards human-centered governance.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. You brought up a number of interesting points, and I really like your comment on, the need to have diversity in the innovation itself, and also the important role that ethics plays. And I think there's a lot of work for the civil society community to come together around, like, what are the ethical standards we want to see out there? And there's need for all of us to have a voice in that. I'd love to continue on that thread, but I'm going to turn it over to Felipa at CHIPS to see to what extent you agree with Lourdes and I, and to talk a little bit about the work you're doing at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies.
Thank you so much, Luisa, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. I'm Felipa, and I'm the head of research at Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, or CHIPS, which is a nonprofit think tank based in Jakarta, Indonesia, that conducts research and advocacy for practical policy recommendations to empower low-income Indonesians to prosper. And I absolutely agree with what Lourdes said and her emphasis on inclusion and coming back to putting humans back into our strategy and our innovations. And that rings true in our work as well. We hear of the potential of the digital economy, and that is why we're focusing our efforts towards policy research on the digital economy in Indonesia and the wider Southeast Asian context. And we know that digital economy has a huge potential to bring all countries towards economic recovery, especially post-pandemic. And even despite the pandemic, or actually I should say that the pandemic actually accelerated the digital transformation in so many countries. And like Indonesia is poised to become Southeast Asia's largest digital economy, worth about $124 billion by 2025. So there's a huge potential there. And that's very enticing for governments around the world. So we push for this digital transformation and focusing our policy attention to achieve this huge target, usually by looking at the infrastructure or the businesses, your unicorns and your startups, and also the systems, which is important. But in that push, we may be forgetting that behind this transformation and behind this potential is the humans that are using the digital economy. And if we come back to focus on the humans, we see that there are still huge digital literacy gaps, especially in developing countries. There is also web accessibility issues for people with disabilities in accessing our internet design, for example, or other systemic barriers also that may threaten this digital economy transformation from being inclusive and actually may risk greater digital divide. We're already seeing those risks manifest. For example, increasing cases of online fraud or misinformation, or people becoming victims to illegal and predatory fintech lending or data violations. And Lourdes also mentioned a good point about AI ethics and how that might benefit or risk some subset of the population, especially when it's used for decision-making and governance and the justice system. So with all of these risks, we completely agree that human-centered digital transformation should be the approach when we look at digital economy, which means putting humans back in the center of our digital transformation strategy and also our governance to make sure that all digital transformation strategy on a national level or also in the global multilateral level is aimed towards empowering humans in the digital economy as producers, as innovators, as sellers, and also as consumers, and making sure that humans are involved in the policymaking and governance process in an inclusive way, not just as a checkbox that you have a public consultation done, but really involving them in a meaningful way in the design process, in the enforcement, and also in the evaluation of the policies that are in place. So that's what we've been doing at CHIPS. We focus on how the individuals and the communities are benefiting from the digital economy. For example, we've published policy brief on to increase digital literacy through school curriculums, or also looking at opportunities and barriers for women in accessing e-commerce space and consumer protection to ensure that humans are in the center of this transformation. We've also been conducting or making the space for government, civil society, and consumers and humans to come together to discuss this, because I think at the heart of it is the dialogue that places humans at the center of our strategy. And so that's, I guess, also what we're doing here today. So I look forward to the discussion again after this about what it means and what it can be done to pursue this further. Back to you, Luisa.
Thank you so much, Felipa. I really think, you touched on dialogue, and I think that's really the heart of it. And I hope this session here today kicks off a bit more dialogue. Because one thing we know about digital transformation is even if it's happening in different countries and markets, it's all interconnected. And so the voice of all of us together is extremely important in order to make sure that the global digital economy, global digital transformation is inclusive of our voices. I want to turn it over now to Paula to get her perspective from Peru and the Latin America region. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you very much, Luisa. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for gathering us to talk about this very important matter, as you mentioned. We are living in a moment of our history that we need to start thinking about putting humans in the center. But first of all, please let me introduce myself. I am a Peruvian attorney, as you mentioned, based in Lima. I have experience advising government entities, major tech companies, and civil society organizations in the drafting of public policies related to emerging technologies with focus in privacy and cybersecurity. I am currently an advisor on digital regulation to the Digital Transformation Secretariat at the Presidency of the Council of Ministers of Peru, and really committed to shaping a better regulatory framework in Latin America. Also, as a personal commitment, I love to teach digital law in the University of Lima because I believe the next generation of lawyers needs to know more about internet governance and embrace this position of open dialogue that you were mentioning before. Also, I am a former Youth IGF ambassador and a board member of the Youth Observatory of Internet Society, and proudly a former Open Internet leader. Proudly advised by CIPE for my project, which I will talk a bit more later. Regarding the human-centered meaning for me, Luisa, well, if I need to put it in a tweet, I would say that it means putting the interest of people and their rights first. That should be our main principle. In that sense, the human-centric approach is making sure that any tech solution coming out can be used by every human being in the planet, not just some, but all. I really concur with what Felipa and Lourdes mentioned. We need to be thinking about diversity, digital inclusion. It would definitely assess, for instance, the impact on privacy, security, and accessibility. For me, that would be the three main words, or a PSA exam, if I would resume. This is the disruptive kind of innovation that we all want, which keeps everyone safe and secure. We need to bring back trust for our digital ecosystem and leave no person behind. Our region in Latin America, there is a huge digital gap, not only connectivity, but also digital literacy. And we are starting to work on that. I think we have plenty of time to talk about it. But just to give a more explanation on that, for instance, we need to incorporate the fact that any digital transformation must be designed and implemented with the human first cap on. It's time to do it. For instance, ask ourselves, this change in the process of a digital transformation in any organization or government, is this putting in risk my team? Will it jeopardize any of their rights? That's what we should be asking ourselves. We need to think about people who are aging, about people who has disabilities, the female entrepreneurs that are just starting in this world and are struggling with some aspects. Everybody is now using technology for their living, for their working, or even for their playing. This is the conjuncture that we're living now. So it is more urgent than ever that we all must act from a human-centric approach. My project on the Open Internet for Democracy program was involved in the research on the COVID-19 contact tracing apps. Just to give you an example, when you ask what is different from now, I did research on the app that were developed in Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay. Unfortunately, some of the apps that were implemented have privacy preserving the centralized Bluetooth technology, whereas others use GPS geolocation and centralized Bluetooth technology when the identity of the users could be revealed. I believe that the urgency of developing these platforms or solutions to tackle the contagion of the virus was done without the consideration of some principles. And that is human-centric. That is what we should be started doing it now. And people like Lourdes or Felipe and their organizations, the program as the Open Internet for Democracy Leaders Project are important programs that will help governments to start thinking about this. Because now that I am in this side of the table, I must say I only have 6 months working in the presidency of the Council of Ministers. Can be hard. We got a lot of things to do in a day-to-day manner. But when someone say with objective numbers, for instance, you are impacting these people, you're jeopardizing their rights, it's like open our eyes and say, yes, we need to start thinking in a different way. And the human-centric approach is the one. I'm happy to start this conversation and exchanging ideas with you. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and with these fantastic ladies.
Thank you so much, Paula. You touched on a number of really relevant topics, and I want to get back to what you mentioned about trust. And at the Center for International Private Enterprise, we work with the global business community in emerging markets and developing countries, and that includes, small, medium-sized businesses, entrepreneurs, and as Felipa mentioned, the digital economy does provide a lot of opportunity for their business and economic inclusion and growth. But I think there is a bit of a trust gap between the way local business communities and civil societies engage and discuss things like technology and digital transformation. And so I'm wondering, how do we help bridge this trust gap and leverage the common priorities of local business communities and civil society so that they can cooperate together towards a more human-centered design that both is kind of designed in recognition of our human rights, as well as the economic opportunities we see coming from technology. Let me throw that back to you, and then we'll continue with the discussion.
Maybe I can jump in, Luisa, or was that for Paula?
Oh, please go ahead, Lourdes.
Yeah. I think we must understand the reason for the trust gap, because the thing about the digital economy is that it tends towards concentration and monopoly. And this is a natural consequence of network economics and the nature of data as a product or a commodity. And so when you have a situation of huge concentrations of resources and shall we say in a sense concentration of data, then you will have the trust gap, because you will have a few entities who command huge amounts of data and data flows, but leaves out the rest, so we've seen the process of how the rise of very dominant online retailers have really led to the struggles of many businesses, many of them small and medium-sized businesses. And these small and medium businesses continue to struggle because of the policies that when they go through concentrated platforms, they have to play the game, and in a sense to their disadvantage, because they don't know what is going on. In most cases, they don't know the game in a sense that is being played, which changes a lot. So there's a huge trust gap because of that. And to address that, we need governments essentially to come in and to make sure that there is fairness in the digital economy. And antitrust policies are a very important part of that fairness, so that small and medium enterprises have a fair playing field. So it really goes back to the economics of the situation. Civil society, on the other hand, we are advocates. We are part of civil society, and it is our role to shed a light on what is going on, to make our voices heard, to advocate for more fairness, so that we can truly say that it's human-centric, because right now it isn't. The priority is profit, not people. And we cannot have human-centeredness without bringing people back into the equation.
Thank you, Lourdes. Felipa, I want to turn to you. Would you agree with Lourdes' assessment? Do you have anything additional you'd add on bringing together, local business communities and civil society with common objectives or priorities that they have? Of course, business owners are not immune to the impact of being citizens. So there's an interconnection there. I'm curious about your thoughts.
Sure. Lourdes brought up really good points, and I see where she's coming from, especially, and that's why we have important civil society work like the work that World Benchmarking Alliance is doing, and just happens to be also part of the ally, which they're doing this benchmarking thing to assess companies on their policies, and that's a really important thing. But I think from our side and our experience talking to businesses and civil societies, there's actually a lot more commonalities than people would expect. Because I think there's a tendency or an instinct to perceive businesses and their pursuit of profit to be directly contradicting human rights or data privacy or your consumer interests. But actually what we find is a lot of these businesses are at the forefront of innovating technologies to protect consumers, to protect data privacy, and to protect consumer protection more so than governments, because sometimes the policymaking process actually lags behind the digital economy innovations. And that's like an interesting part that we see happening in a lot of developing countries, where actually businesses and civil society, if they can come together in dialogues and spaces where, of course, there might be disagreements, but oftentimes there would be a lot of agreements in terms of how digital economy and digital businesses have to protect data, which is also important for their businesses as well, to earn consumer trust, to be able to make sure that consumer actually want to use their products, or consumer protection to ensure that people are actually using their product and feel safe in using those products. So there are a lot of commonalities in that sense. And I think with those commonalities, local businesses and civil society can play a huge role together as allies to advocate and perhaps even exert pressures on governments and decision makers to be able to open the space up for voices from small businesses and civil society advocates to be heard in the policymaking process, so that it's not a state-centered top-down approach, but really coming back to the humans, both from the business perspective, but also from the civil society perspective.
Thank you so much, Felipa. I agree with several of your points, and it kind of leads us in nicely to our next question, which is, we know we want, the substance of how we're regulating to protect human rights, but I want to turn it over to the governance itself. So, do we need new protocols and standards or governance mechanisms that are more human-centered or participatory and iterative? I'll throw it back to you, and then I'd love to hear what both Paula and Lourdes think.
Oh, absolutely. I think the current policymaking process is the traditional ones that we have so far must adapt to the velocity of the digital economy innovation. It's happening so rapidly that the regular policymaking processes can lag behind. You see this with the policymaking process in parliament, in executive bodies everywhere, which is why the traditional state-centered top-down approach does not work. But so does full self-regulation by the companies. That also does not work. Lourdes brought up really good points, and that's why there needs to be accountability as well and checks and balances. So I think it has to be somewhere in between those two approaches. And at CHIPS, we've been examining the potential of co-regulation approaches, which is a balance of both, meaning that the governance of the digital economy is democratized, and that involves businesses and civil society, not just in the design process, but also the enforcement of the governance, and also later on the evaluation, because of course these policies, they have to adapt to new innovations and new findings and new challenges again. So we look at co-regulation as a sharing of those responsibilities, and there have been interesting policymaking innovations and tools that we've seen work. For example, one real example coming from Indonesia, and which also has been applied in other country contexts, is the concept of regulatory sandbox, where private companies, for example, in Indonesia, let's say the fintech businesses in the fintech sector, can experiment or try out their innovations to come up with unique ways to increase financial inclusion through the use of data to check credit worthiness. So this is helping a lot of the unbanked population that cannot go to the traditional banks, but in a safe and secure way that does not violate data privacy. And this happens within close coordination and monitoring with governments and civil societies as well. So we're seeing a lot of innovative approaches, and hopefully this can be also applied or inspire other innovative approaches in other subsectors of the digital economy.
Thank you, Felipa. Paula, are you seeing the same innovations or new governance approaches in Peru or throughout Latin America?
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, actually, 2 weeks ago, a regulation was approved in Peru. It is the regulations of the Urgency Decree 006, which mandates that any regulation regarding to the system of digital transformation, which includes matters of connectivity, digital talent, digital education, digital economy, must be developed in a multi-stakeholder forum. We are following the directions of the UN, the multi-stakeholder governance, and it was a great success for us because it took a very long time to be approved. You know that in order to a supreme decree is approved, and at least here in Peru, we have to get the approval of all the ministers. So it was a very important dialogue process for all of us. But it's important that we understand that governments must intensify all our efforts so that the internet is not fragmented anymore. I really agree with what Felipa and Lourdes were mentioning. I think this regulation that makes this process mandatory is a huge step, but now we want to translate this from the paper or the law from the to the action, sorry. So it's time to start. And what we have done already is starting a committee, a multi-stakeholder committee for the development of the digital talent national strategy, which actually I am leading. And it is a huge responsibility because we have incorporated people from the Andes. So it's not always that they are incorporated, also SMEs. It's, as you mentioned, it's a lack of participation, but the reality is that no one set of actors by their own will tackle all the challenges by themselves. So we need to have a collective response, policymakers, local business communities, not only from the capital, but also for the regions, and also civil society. We have a great group of experts speaking about how to develop digital capacities in Peru, because we have a huge digital talent gap that we need to tackle, especially in women and the minorities. So we're working on that. Also, if I may just add, when you mentioned that what do we have to do, maybe in protocols, I would say have ethical frameworks. It's kind of difficult to find a global framework so that the developed and the developing countries can follow. But it's time that the G20 economies that have power among the others would firmly start adopting the human-centric approach and start adopting this multi-stakeholder approach to bring the local business communities, because I mean, we always are speaking about SMEs, but it's not that often that we have SMEs on the table. So if we don't listen to their needs, how are we going to find solutions for them? I am right now taking a course with CIPE on e-commerce, and I was watching two videos, interviews from SMEs that were saying, we have a couple of initiatives to help us develop our e-commerce, but the government gave us funds, but that's not what we want. We need contacts to do our exports. We need contacts or another SME that have already done this. And for the government, it was, what? Do you need money? And actually they need, but they also need another things such as a good coaching or mentoring. So it's time that we start doing that, listening to them. And of course, having civil society on the table, it's always important. But it's time the governance, want to listen, because civil society is always sending us open letters, and they are always willing to help.
Thank you, Paula. Lourdes, I know you have a slightly different perspective. So, building off of what Paula touched on and what she'd like to see from the G20 leaders, what are you hoping to see so that the next time you do your digital benchmarking, the results don't astound you, which is a big word to use with that?
Thanks, Luisa. Before I come to that, I'd like to address your question on what tools are already there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of the policy tools, a lot of the protocols, the possible rules and legal or otherwise are already there, are already available. So we have a spectrum, and we need to embrace this spectrum of tools. So at the World Benchmarking Alliance, we actually exist in this part, in one part of the spectrum where we're providing an accountability, a public accountability mechanism on what companies should be doing, what they should be responsible for, tracking this and showing the public if they are indeed doing what they say they would like to do. So that's one thing. That's voluntary. It's a form of self-governance. That's already a very powerful tool for action. For example, based on that and on the astounding findings on AI ethics, we're building this global collective impact coalition together with our allies, with large institutional investors at the core of it, willing to invest responsibly and tell the companies that they own that, hey, you need to improve your performance. And we're very happy to, whoever is listening and to my fellow panelists, if you want to join this coalition for us to drive ethical, changes in the use and deployment of AI, very happy to welcome you in this coalition. That's one tool. But when these voluntary actions, when these private sector mechanisms, are not enough, the large companies are not making enough progress on their own, then that's when government steps in. And government does not have to create new tools. It has already a lot in its arsenal, from antitrust to very basic rules on privacy, etc., that just needs to be enforced and implemented in all sincerity. With respect to human rights, there's already the human guiding principles for business and human rights. There's already the notion of human rights due diligence, which in many countries are becoming mandatory, because it seems that it's not happening enough. So that's where that's basically where the G20 comes in. I mean, it was very interesting reading the recent G20 declaration on the digital economy. There are a lot of things in that declaration which are quite welcome. As you know, it mentions a lot of things on human-centered development, focusing on small and medium enterprises, turning the task force into a permanent working group. So now, the G20 will have its own digital economy working group. Those are all very good things. But I think it could add, highlight the role of private sector mechanisms, such as what we're doing, accountability, corporate accountability for the private sector, using I did say that there's profits and people, but you can also mobilize profits for people. So how do you do that? And that's a bit, I think, missing from the declaration. More mention of inclusion, more focus on digital inclusion, more focus on strong agreements across the board, harmonized policies that create fairness in the market, so that it's really a globally fair playing field, which at the moment is not, by nature of the network economies scale. So that's something that I'd like to bring to this table.
Luisa, if I may jump in, because I think Lourdes raised an important point that I think it's a good shift in how we talk about this digital economy governance. It's not just about the policy, but it is about the enforcement first and foremost, because we see that happening in a lot of contexts where the policy is there, but then it's not enforced at all. And we see that happening in cases of violations of data privacy. So there are data breaches and then just nothing come out of it. So companies is not put into account into violations of human rights and data rights. But I think some limitations that we have to acknowledge on the government side, especially in developing countries, they don't really, from the government side, there's not, it's very hard or challenging for them to be the sole enforcer of this. So that's why I think the role of civil society and also the role of business associations and private sector play a significant part in enforcement. And that's where also the government should open up the space and acknowledge the limitations of not being able to enforce everything, so that you have to rely on private sector, for example, on content moderation, for example, on data privacy, but also having civil society there as check and balances, and to make sure that the enforcement mechanisms are being run very well to follow up on the policy. Maybe just an interesting comment from Lourdes.
Thank you, Felipa. And I mean, you're in an interesting position right now. You're on this panel with us at the C20, and next year Indonesia will have the presidency of the G20. And as a think tank operating in Indonesia and working very closely on these digital topics, I mean, what are some things you would like to see in terms of priorities for the Indonesian government, or conversations around making it more human-centered, or of course, building off of Chip's work on co-regulation. What are some of your priorities that you'd like to pass along to them?
Yes, thank you so much. We are indeed quite excited to host next year's G20 and also the engagement groups. I think what I would like to see from our presidency next year would be a continuation of the good effort and also continuing the dialogue from this year's G20 into next year, but not on just the agreement, but an actionable steps towards implementing the agreement that has been made. In addition, we also are interested next year to focus on the digital inclusion aspects and putting humans back. I think that is a huge concern for the Indonesian government, especially with increasing digital literacy gap, increasing digital divide for people in rural areas, people in lower income communities. So inclusivity is a huge key for next year's task forces, hopefully. And then related to that, I think I would also like to see a lot more discussions on a disaggregated level. I think disaggregated data would be very key to understand how different subsets of the population would participate meaningfully in the digital economy. So not just talking about digital economy as a whole, but looking at how rural areas are experiencing digital economy, how women or people with disabilities may face unique barriers that prevent them from fully benefiting from the digital economy. So more attention through these kinds of research can help ensure that policies address these barriers. And then last but not least, I would really love to see opening up the space for more dialogue between civil society, private sector, and also the government to participate in a meaningful way, but and also advocating for this. And that's some of our hopes.
Wonderful, thank you. You made some really important points about sort of inclusion of civil society and business groups that are not in the capital cities, whose voices tend not to be heard. Paula, you touched on this as well. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about that process and how your work has managed to include communities whose voices are not typically involved in this, and sort of what you would want to see from G20 leaders to ensure that more of these processes are inclusive and accessible to those who, tend to be excluded in policymaking, in digital transformation.
Yes, Luisa. Well, first of all, it's our role to bring together all the stakeholders. In my opinion, that's the role of the governments, not just providing initiatives or, as I mentioned, giving some funds to do that, if not just bringing them together. So we were doing some research, and they are important startups, entrepreneurships that need talent. And what do we do? Then connect them to people in the rural areas, not just the capital, as you see, or just provide these companies with a space to go and speak to national universities in the rural space or in.
Well, Paula, I think we may have lost you. So I'm going to turn it over to Lourdes. I want to hear from you regarding the work that the World Benchmarking Alliance is doing, and how we can get. You did invite different people in to be part of like the AI ethics conversation, but how do we get a wider community involved in, the type of the work of monitoring enforcement, monitoring private sector action, being, part of the monitoring enforcement, both as civil society, looking at a global perspective like you do, but also sort of in their own countries and communities.
That's a really great question, Luisa, because we're getting to the heart of the matter of how we can work together as civil society actors, bringing the voices of the people forward. There are some practicalities to the issue that we realize as we build the coalition and this collective impact coalition on AI ethics that we are currently working on to build and sustain and really unleash out there the full power of multi-stakeholder actions. It's astounding that it's novel and it's unique to bring together to the same table civil society with large investors, with business platforms, with think tanks. This seemed to be something that is actually not yet quite as common as we think. And often civil society, our colleagues in civil society, when they come in, are often very much constrained by resources and bandwidth for people, etc. That's why it's really very important, especially among the large and rich countries in the G20, to show sincere support for civil society, not just listening to civil society, but when it's possible to consider in their overall, in their overseas development cooperation strategies, development aid, to provide support to civil society so that civil society can indeed bring their voices globally and be heard. And we hope we can play a small part through our work to bring more national, more local civil society actors to the attention of the global international policy movers and shakers. And I think that's what we need to do. There's a disconnect, and we need to raise up those local voices. But often there's a lot of constraints on resourcing. So we have to address the resourcing issues for civil society. And I think that's a crucial way forward.
Thanks very much. I'm just thinking about the previous C20 dialogues or summits. And now that we've transitioned online, I'd like to imagine that that's made them more inclusive, but certainly there are still a lot of people who have, limited access to internet, or their bandwidth isn't good, or this type of information and opportunities to be part of, a civil society community really working at the forefront of these issues is not always, made available, or the information doesn't get to them. But I as part of my opening, I did touch on how we do have a lot of these important tools. I mean, these digital tools, while they do provide or pose some serious risks, as Paula and Felipa and you talked about, they also provide opportunity to do this work in a different way, to include voices that have previously been excluded. I want to turn it back over to Paula, if her connection has improved, to talk a bit more about how the work you mentioned, Peru has managed to be so inclusive of communities that are, tend to be disproportionately excluded in the kind of policy making and policy implementation work.
Thank you, Luisa. I hope you can hear me well. Thanks a lot. I'm glad. Yes, what we have been doing, and I think in most of the Latin American countries, we have now these labs in the laboratories of government and innovation. And through this laboratory, which is under the presidency of the Council of Ministers in Peru, we have a number of investigators that, before COVID-19, they travel to the rural areas and speak with them. And right now that I am in the office, I am reading all these interviews, so I got a taste of what they needed. That's why we were working on these regulations that I mentioned that were approved 2 weeks ago. But we have to keep this connection with them. Now that we are not able to travel, it's a bit challenging, I must say. The connection with the communities is not the same, but we have the commitment, and I a bit unfortunate to say that it is about politic aim, and it's voluntary that they do that, because when you change the leader, this might change, unfortunately. So it's about that politics get this approach, adopt it. But what we have been doing also is we have a table for professors, teachers, because we're working on a digital strategy, but we cannot forget that teachers are at the center of the classroom. And if they don't have the tools, then students will not learn. And we would like that everyone, that every children gets these digital skills, for instance. I also need to mention that there are some initiatives to bring connectivity. This is one of the more important bridges that we have in Latin America and also in Peru. There is an IDB report that was released this year that mentioned that if we worked in this connectivity gap, we would be learning like 15 million direct jobs. We would boost regional economic growth by 7% GDP. So we need to work on that, because there are a lot of initiatives. We will give away tablets. That's what they said last year. But unfortunately, children could not do anything with that because they don't even have electricity. So it's important we go 2 steps backwards and say, what are the real needs? Unfortunately, right now, digital education is done in the Amazonian and the rural areas through WhatsApp. What happened on Monday was devastating for our children because they couldn't have classes with their professors through WhatsApp. Yes, and it's important to have a plan B. That's why we immediately got reunited with the Ministry of Education and another stakeholders, also civil society present, because we cannot be relying on only one tool, a free tool. We must give them, these communities, another alternatives. It's I know, Lourdes, I agree with you. There are a lot of policies, but at least in our region, we have seen that when we don't have these mandatory norms that say you need to include all the stakeholders, you need to tackle specific situations, they don't do it. So that's why I was saying we need these norms, maybe some cultural stuff in Latin America, but yes, and actually great allies are business communities. In Peru, we work with the ASEP, it's called the Association of Peruvian Entrepreneurs. With them, we're working on a series of skills or capacity building sessions for entrepreneurs with focus on women that we will be launching on November. They are very important. Also, the NGO Hiperderecho in Peru that fights for digital rights are also our good allies, because as you mentioned, or as I mentioned before, we have the good intention to do, but sometimes we don't have the lenses of the glasses of diversity and we don't see it. But we need to be open to hear critics. Government needs to adopt the entrepreneur way of working, I believe. We can make mistakes, but it's important to get to know it in a rapid way and change the way we're doing it. The Sandbox, as you mentioned, Felipa, it's something we're doing in Peru for FinTech. The Finance Regulatory Agency, fortunately, agreed to do it 2 months ago. So we started with that. It's a controlled way to adopt innovation, but taking care of. It is adopting all accessibility measures, including all the communities. So yes, it's part of our work to watch out that all digital transformation are sustainable and inclusive.
Thank you, Paula. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I would encourage everyone watching who wants to continue this conversation to reach out to us. And you can follow CIPE on Twitter and get involved in this ongoing conversation on human-centered design for governance and through digital transformation. I want to thank our hosts in Italy, and I want to thank our fantastic panelists, Lourdes, Felipa, Paula, for your contributions, and to all of you for joining us. Civil society has such an important role to play right now, especially as our world undergoes digital transformation, and we look forward to working with all of you. Many thanks for participating today, and I hope to speak with you all again. Bye.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Bye.